But let's talk to Anne Widdecombe, a woman who is so filled with common sense, she's almost as good as I am. Anne, a very good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much for joining us. I loved your column this morning. I think it absolutely hits the nail right on the head. You know, the budget wasn't really the problem. The reaction to the budget was ludicrous in a way. But the point is, as a politician, you have to learn to roll with the punches and deal with whatever it is that you're trying to deal with.
Well, of course you do. I mean, I think the problem is largely the Conservative Parliamentary Party, which these days is an undisciplined rabble. It's governed by jitters. If anything starts to go wrong, it goes into a panic. I mean, you imagine this lot trying to have run the Second World War. You know, the instant we'd had Dunkirk, they'd have been putting up their hands in surrender. I mean, the whole point of government is you have to work through problems. You don't just surrender as soon as they come along, and that's what Liz Truss has done. You know, she told us for days on end that she was going to stick with her policy, and then she backs off it. Why does she back off it? Not because there's anything wrong with the policy, but because of the reaction from her own party.
Well, the hysteria around this 45% income tax rate is quite remarkable, isn't it? I mean, it tells you what sort of a mad world we currently live in, where this is a tax that was put on by Gordon Brown pretty much at the end of Labour's governmental period. So for the large portion of Tony Blair's reign and Gordon Brown's reign, the higher tax rate was 40%. It wasn't 45%.
No, it was indeed 40%. And what we do know as a matter of historical fact is that when governments reduced the top tax rate, as Thatcher did from 60 to 40, and then in a later period when it was reduced from 50 to 45, the intake to the Treasury from that group of taxpayers actually goes up. It doesn't go down because quite suddenly, you know, it's worth taking the extra risk. It isn't worth all the accountancy scams. It's just plain common sense. Now, if you're going to get more in, or at the very worst, it's going to be cost neutral, what is all the fuss about this kind of spending 150 billion to support people in the energy crisis? It proposes to spend a miserable little 2 billion at max on a tax cut, and the world goes mad. Yeah.
So why did all these Tory party backbenchers throw themselves lemming-like off the cliff?
Because they panic. Because quite obviously the opposition to this was always going to be, this is the Tories looking after their rich friends. And instead of meeting that with the arguments for reducing the upper tax rate, they met it with panic. And I think Liz Truss's, and frankly any other Prime Ministers, it showed with Boris, their really big problem is going to be that there is no longer any discipline at all, no collective responsibility, not only in the Tory Parliamentary Party, but also in the Cabinet itself. We've got Cabinet Ministers now pronouncing on the not even announced benefits cut, and you've actually got the Cabinet having its discussions in public.
Yeah. It is an extraordinary time. I mean, I can't remember anything ever as bad as this. And the Tory party has been bad in the past. It has self-harmed in the past. It always brings its own people down rather than letting somebody else do it. But this is really unprecedented, it seems to me, because, as you say, Penny Mordaunt's talking about a policy reversal when the policy hasn't even been announced, it hasn't been made. And also, when did Tory party MPs suddenly decide it was a bad idea to give rich people tax cuts and a good idea to give unemployed people a pay rise?
Well, the discussions about benefits cuts have to be seen as something separate. They have to be seen as something in their own right. I think we would all say there are two sorts of people on benefit. There are those who have absolutely no choice at all, and they're not well looked after because we're too busy spending on those who do have a choice.
Yes.
And that is the sheer nonsense of the benefit system.
Yes, and the benefit system needs to be reformed massively. I've never thought it was a good idea, and I've said this many times, to subsidise employers who don't pay people enough money. You know, it's not the government's job to pay people who can't make enough money from the company they work for, because the company should be paying them, surely.
Well, I mean, if the company can't afford to pay its staff, then it is not a successful company. I mean, period. You know, and even very, very small companies, as they're growing, they only take on staff as they need them. And if they need them, then they can afford to pay them.
Yeah, exactly right. So where do we actually go from here? And what can we expect from Liz Truss, do you think, today when she gets up just after 11 o'clock?
Well, she'll talk big. I mean, this lot have talked like Churchill and they've acted like the Grand Old Duke of York. I mean, that is what really sums it up. You know,
Yeah.
they talk about on the beaches and they'll fight to the end and this is right and they're not for turning. And then 5 minutes later, they're pulling their troops back down the hill, you know, and they're neither up nor down. And that is how they're reacting. So I don't have confidence in this government to keep its nerve under pressure. No confidence at all. Now, we hear a lot of big talk today, and because it is the big set piece, the conference will clap and the conference will cheer, and it will all look pretty good. But the real test, of course, is what happens the next day? What happens when they get back to the business of governing, if that's what you can call what they're doing?
Yeah. Well, because what they've now done is given an opportunity to their enemies, i.e. the Labour Party, to basically give them enough grief over any policy they want to introduce, and they'll just back off it.
Well, the two people who are laughing the loudest at the moment, I mean, must be Keir Starmer, and, of course, also the EU.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we were going to be extra competitive, we were going to take on the EU, we were going to make the most of Brexit, and now all you can hear is the sound of knees crawling along the ground. No, actually, we're not going to do those things. So, you know, yes, of course, all this has done is give aid and comfort to the enemy.
Yeah. And, I mean, as I said, it's important for us to remember sometimes that it's not the enemy within that is the problem, you know, because if they carry on with this, it will be the enemy without. It will be the Labour Party that wins the next election. I mean, the polls are appalling, and I don't believe that in 2 years' time those polls will be the same. But I guess the $64,000 question is, can Liz Truss stay in power long enough for there to be a big enough gap for her to fix things enough so that the Tories can win back power?
Well, you're right that the polls almost certainly won't be the same in 2 years' time. I think there is a tendency amongst the panickers to think that what prevails today is, you know, going to prevail forever, and that's never been true. That's never been true. So you're right on that score, but unless the Conservative Parliamentary Party takes a good long look at those polls and says, we can't meet this by being disunited, we've got to meet this by having a united front, unless it does that, I mean, I think there is nothing that Liz Truss can do. I mean, the farce is the Labour Party is probably even more deeply divided along ideological grounds than ours ever was.
Well, I think, I mean, watching Labour Party conference last week, which now seems about a million years ago, I don't remember any policies coming out other than Keir Starmer wanting to start his own energy company.
Well, I mean, I think they're taking a leaf out of Blair's book. I mean, the more you announce policy before a general election, the more time you give your opponents to rubbish it and to tear it apart and all the rest of it. So you don't announce policy, you announce sound bites, basically. You know, you make everything sound jolly good. And you know, for the many, not the few, we can all remember the Blair sound bites. And that's effectively what they're doing. No, they've got nothing to offer. And what Liz Truss was doing is right, but she's been knocked off course. And now the big problem is not just that she's been knocked off course, but that everybody must surely be thinking, well, she's very easy to knock off.
Well, yeah. Well, that seems to be the problem. And she doesn't seem to have very good advisors. She doesn't seem to have a very good sort of network of people around her who are advising her and telling her what she should do and what she shouldn't do, because she's made blunder after blunder after blunder. But